afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's okay. It's just started hammering it down here, so I hope it's drier where you are. So what are we going to talk about this afternoon? We're going to talk about the job support scheme, which is the new scheme that's obviously going to come in to replace or to substitute from the furlough scheme when that ends at the end of October. And at the end, I'm just going to touch on the job retention bonus, just because we've had some clarification and we've had a Treasury direction just to clarify on those points, just so that we're clear on where we are, although there's more guidance in relation to both of these schemes that will be due out from the government. So starting with the job support scheme. So you will be aware that the Chancellor announced on the 24th of September that he would be introducing, after much pressure, a job support scheme, which effectively is a variant of short-time working. It means that employees will have a reduction in their working hours, but it's slightly different to short-time working because there's some additional financial benefits or incentives, and also other conditions that will apply. It's deemed to come into force on the 1st of November and will initially run for a 6-month period. It is in addition to that job retention bonus scheme, which I have spoken about in other webinars. So it is something that's seen as an additional scheme and not an either-or scheme, so to speak. So how does the scheme work? So the principle of it is that the employee will be required to work at least 33% of their usual hours, and then they'll have their pay topped up. So with respect to the unworked time, that's the 77%, that'll be split in 3 ways. So firstly, the employer will still be required to pay for a further third of unworked time. The government will pay for a third of unworked time, and then the final third will actually be unpaid. So that means that the employee working a minimum of 33% of their normal hours will receive 77% of their usual pay. And that's comprised as follows. So the 33% for the time that they're working obviously needs to be paid by the government for the hours that they actually work. 22% has to be paid by the employer to top up that pay for unworked time. 22% is then topped up by the government of unworked time, and as I've said, the remaining 22% on top of that will be unpaid. Now, the maximum contribution that the government will make per month for an employee is £697.92. So obviously that's going to be a substantial change in terms of contribution from the government, as opposed to the furlough scheme, which we've seen go from 80% through to 70%, and of course this month a 60% contribution. And of course the caps that were in play for furlough were much higher than that cap that I've just informed you of in terms of what the government will pay per month. It's pretty clear, therefore, that where this is introduced and those employees are higher paid employees, that they'll be impacted the greatest. It's not clear whether or not the cap that the government pays will be reduced if the employee does work more than 33%, because obviously the minimum threshold is to work 33%, but if you could offer the employee more hours, it's unclear as to whether or not that would see a reduction in what the government pays. What I would say is that the government have indicated that the rate of this 22% that they would pay, which is a third of the amount that's not covered by the usual hours, could be subject to change from January onwards. So this is set for initially a 3-month period, and then will be reviewed. And it may be, that's not guaranteed, but it may be that that contribution from the government again will change. It may well decrease, as furlough did. So it may be that you have to then pay more money to remain part of the scheme in terms of having the contribution from the government. So what other costs will you have to pay as the employer? So as is currently the case with the furlough scheme, from the 1st of August, you had to pay for the employer NICs and the pension contributions, both of which had previously been met by the government. So those are additional costs on top of the minimum 33% plus the 22% that you would need to pay by way of pay for hours worked then topped up. Now, we don't have any guidance at the moment as to what those contributions would be payable on, but obviously it could relate to not only the pay that is for the hours actually worked. It could cover the top up, and also the government's top-up. So at this stage, we are waiting for some further guidance as to what those employer NICs and the pension contributions will relate to. What if you're unable to pay the top-up? So you may be able to say, well, actually, we can probably meet the 33% of the minimum hours and that pay, but we can't meet the additional 22%. Well, this is a key obligation under the scheme. So if you're unable to meet that top up, then really you'd need to look at different options, and the scheme probably won't be feasible for you. Those might look like things like layoff and short-time working, and you need to have a look at the contracts of employment to see whether or not that's possible or not. If you haven't got those provisions in the contract, then you need to have a look and see whether you can reach agreement with the employees with respect to a period of short-time working. Or, of course, the other opportunity is to consider redundancies. And obviously, this scheme is supposed to avoid redundancies. So how will they calculate the usual pay and the usual hours? So again, we're waiting for further guidance on this point, but the guidance that we've had so far suggests that the calculations will be similar to those that were used when calculating your usual hours and pay under the furlough scheme. So if employees have been furloughed, you will not be able to use those calculations based on furlough pay, because these calculations have to be based on the employee's normal pay and hours. Can you vary the hours that are worked by the employee each week? So again, the guidance that we've had so far suggests that you can. There appears to be no requirement to work the same pattern each month, but what you need to take into account is that each short-time working period needs to be a minimum of 7 days. So this therefore suggests that the amount that you can claim for unworked hours can change each week, but overall, that is subject to the employee working their minimum of 33% of hours and receiving their pay for that plus the top up. Can you undertake redundancy consultation or put employees at risk of redundancy whilst you're still claiming under this scheme? So the current guidance, which I'll comment on next, suggests that employees are unable to be made redundant, neither can you put them on notice of redundancy during a period when you're claiming under this scheme. That therefore suggests that you could start redundancy consultations, and for example, you could put employees at risk of redundancy while still claiming under the scheme, but you cannot issue any notices of redundancy. Obviously, that's something that we need further clarification on, and also differs from the furlough scheme, because of course you could use the furlough scheme to contribute towards notice payments, because you could give notice to employees to terminate their employment by reason of redundancy whilst they're still furloughed. So following on from that, are you able to give notice of redundancy or make employees redundant whilst you're claiming on the scheme? As we've seen, then you know, it looks as if you can commence the consultation, but you shouldn't really be giving any notices of redundancy. What calculation should we use for the redundancy pay if you've got somebody who's receiving the grant under the scheme? So again, we need further guidance on this point, but if the principle is followed that applied with respect to furlough, then it's likely that the payments have to be made on the employee's normal full pay rather than any reduced pay that they might receive under this scheme. If you couldn't afford to continue with the scheme and needed to make redundancies, so if you weren't in that situation, if you said, well, actually, this is a situation where we can afford to use the scheme, but we want to make some top-ups, this is currently unclear. So we know that under the furlough scheme, you could elect to top up pay if you wanted to do so. We haven't got any guidance on whether that's possible under this grant scheme or not. The premise of the scheme is that the employee will take a wage reduction, and there's an expectation that you cannot, as an employer, top up the wages above the 2/3 contribution. But as I said, as with furlough, this was encouraged by the government if it was possible. So it may well be that the same principles will apply again, but we need further guidance on that point. Now then, what if during the scheme the employee is sick, told to shield again, or the employee takes holiday? Well, in the event that an employee was sick in normal circumstances, they'd be entitled to statutory sick pay or perhaps company sick pay. Obviously, if it was COVID, there's a minimum entitlement from day one to statutory sick pay. But it's not clear yet under this scheme how sickness will be dealt with. So again, we need further guidance on this point and holiday. With respect to holiday, obviously employees could take holiday during the furlough scheme as long as the company topped up the pay and they received their full rate for any holiday that's taken. It's unclear under the scheme at the moment whether that 33% minimum working hours will need to be topped up in terms of holiday pay to ensure that the employee receives their statutory entitlement. And again, we're looking for further guidance on this point. What if employees who are shielding confirm that they're not able to come back to work, or they don't come back because they believe it's unsafe? So firstly, you know you've got an obligation to ensure that the workplace is COVID safe or COVID secure. Secondly, you will have carried out your risk assessments in relation to individual employees to ensure that that's the case. So it's clear, isn't it, that there's a requirement of 33% of minimum hours that have to be worked. That means if the employee is shielding and refusing to come to work because they don't believe it to be safe, and unless they can carry out that work from home, you would be unable to access the scheme because the employee actually has to deliver 33% of their hours being worked. And obviously that differs significantly under furlough, because for employees who were sick on furlough, then at the end of the day, you could use the furlough scheme to continue to pay them. So you'd need to again consider what the position might be. Obviously, if the employee refuses to come back to work and you believe that you're providing a COVID safe environment, then there could be a disciplinary issue. You might agree that the employee could remain at home on unpaid leave. If the employee becomes sick, then SSP or other sick pay entitlements could be paid if this is not COVID related. If the workplace is not COVID safe and the employee is prevented from returning to work because they believe that you are not providing a safe environment, then they have the right to elect not to do so under the Health and Safety Act. And that means that you would be responsible potentially for paying full pay, which is why it's so important to ensure that you're taking the measures that you are to provide a safe working environment. Now, another question is, because this applied during furlough, are employees able to take another part-time job during the hours that they're not working for the company? So we know under the furlough scheme, employees were permitted to work elsewhere, either on a full-time basis or part-time basis during their furloughed hours. At this stage, it's not clear whether the same principles will apply, but it seems likely, and we need further guidance on this point as well. So how and when will you be able to claim? So it appears from the guidance that you'll be able to make claims online from December 2020. Grant payments are going to be paid monthly in arrears in terms of the government's contribution. This means that you'll have to front load payments to then be reimbursed by the government, and you'll need to factor that into your calculations. Now, when making their grants and their contributions to you, the government will be looking at the RTI system through HMRC to determine what payments should be made. Another question is whether the scheme is open to all or any sectors. At the end of the day, it had been certain sectors, things like events, hospitality, that have been lobbying the government, and therefore there may be some questions around whether any sector can use the scheme. What I can say is there's no limitation to the sectors that can use the scheme, and it's open to all. As long as you as an employer have eligible employees, a UK bank account and a UK PAYE scheme. Now, SMEs, which are single management enterprises, and I would anticipate that quite a lot of you fall into that category, will not have to meet any financial conditions to be eligible to use the scheme. However, larger companies may need to. We need some further guidance on what the definition of an SME is. But if it follows what it states in the Companies Act 2006, then an SME, to be an SME, a company needs to meet at least two of the following conditions. So firstly, it's got 250 or less employees, an annual turnover of 36 million or below, and a balance sheet total of 18 million or below. So it's uncertain at this stage what definition will be used or how groups will be affected. So we'll need to just wait for further guidance on that as well. So on that basis, will the company have to prove the impact of COVID-19 to be able to make a claim? Now, if you're an SME and you meet the definition that they subsequently confirm will apply to SMEs, then you will not need to do so. If you're a large employer, and if we use that example that I gave to you, then it's any company that is above those conditions, then some evidence will need to be provided to show that turnover is lower as a result of the pandemic. Again, we need to wait for further guidance in terms of how that will be assessed. Now, some of you no doubt will have seen in the media comments around whether dividends or other contributions can be paid out by larger companies to their shareholders if they're claiming under the scheme. It's expected that those larger employers will not be able to pay out dividends or other contributions or distributions to its shareholders whilst they're making use of the scheme. At this stage, that looks as if it applies to large employers only, but again, we need guidance on that point. So, is the scheme only available where employees have previously been furloughed? There is no need for the company to prove that employees have been furloughed in order to take advantage of the new scheme. It can be used for employees who've previously been furloughed or those that have not. It means that it can be used, therefore, in a much broader way across the workforce and include those that have continued to work throughout the pandemic, whether that be on reduced or full hours. It remains the case that in the interim, until the end of October, flexi furlough is still only available to be used where employees were previously furloughed up to the 10th of June. And we know that flexi furlough has been available from the 1st of July and will end at the end of October. So which of your employees will be eligible? So firstly, employees have to have been on your PAYE payroll on or before the 23rd of September. That means any RTI submissions must have been made before that date. And the employee must work 33% of their usual hours. So actually, it's quite limited in terms of what the employee needs to do to be eligible. Oh, let's just get rid of that. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what that was. Something came up on my screen. I've got rid of it anyway. So what if there is no work available or there is a local lockdown and employees cannot work from home? So if we look at the lockdown position first, because we're seeing a lot stricter measures being applied, certainly in the north at the moment, what will happen if employees can work from home for 33% of their time, then there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to continue to use the scheme. So if there's a lockdown, you've got people working at home and they're able to work 33% of their time, then the scheme is still applicable and you can use it. What if employees cannot work from home and due to the lockdown they're also unable to attend work? Well, at this stage, it's difficult to assess what that position may be. If this was outside of furlough, then you'd be obliged to make payment to the employees of their full pay unless the employee agreed to a reduction in pay. And I'm hoping that the guidance that comes out will address that point. Secondly, if you're unable to provide 33% of the employee's hours for them to work, then you will not be able to access the scheme. So do you have to guarantee that 33% of the hours each week will be worked? We need further guidance as to whether that's the case or whether an average will be taken over, for example, the period of a month. The guidance suggests that you can move employees in and out of the scheme for periods where they're not working their required minimum of 33% of their usual hours. However, what is not clear is what the arrangements will be during that period. So you may need to fall back on short time working or lay off during those periods. And again, you need to have a look at what your contract provides for. So what do you really need to think about now? It is clear that this scheme overall will be more costly to the company than the furlough scheme. The government in its guidance has provided an example of an individual who normally works 5 days per week and earns £350 a week. Now, this is on a fact sheet published by the government, so please feel free to go and review that. So the example confirms the company puts the individual onto the scheme working 2 days per week out of their 5. This amounts to 40% of the employee's usual hours. The employer pays £140 for the 2 days that the employee works. So they've done 350 divided by 5 times by 2 for the 2 days that are being worked. That gives the sum of £140. Because of how then the scheme addresses the other amount of time, the other 77%, the employer will then need to pay an additional £70 for the days that the individual does not work. The government then will be required to pay a further £70 for the hours that are not worked. The remaining third of that unworked time will be the bit that's unpaid. So it's clear from the calculation that ordinarily that 2 days that would be worked by the employee outside of the scheme would cost the company £140. However, for the 2 days that will apply under this scheme, it will cost the company £210 because they've got to pay for a further day out of the 3 days that the individual does not work to top up. So therefore, it evidences an additional 50% cost to the company, even though the employee is working reduced hours. In addition, of course, and on top of that, you'll need to pay the pension contributions and the national insurance contributions on top, the employer national insurance contributions. So you will need to think about how that additional cost can be accommodated by the company and whether other options may seem more attractive. So that could be, as we've said, layoff and short-time working if the contract permits, unpaid leave if this can be agreed with the employee, or it may be the case that redundancies may not be avoided. And I know the scheme is supposed to avoid redundancies, but as you can see, it can be much more costly to the business than, say, the furlough scheme was. So as with the furlough scheme, do you have to reach agreement with the employee to put them onto the scheme? So the guidance so far suggests that agreement must be reached for the new short-time working arrangement. So it will need to confirm that there's a change to the employment contract by agreement. It'll need to be in writing, and any agreements, as with furlough, will need to be made available to HMRC if HMRC requests it. The agreement that is used to issue to the employee will need to cover how many hours they're required to work, how the top-up will work in terms of the scheme. So there's still set information, a bit like when you issued furlough agreements. It's still the case as well that you would need to issue an agreement to those individuals. It will also need to address what will happen in relation to unworked hours. It also needs to provide flexibility to move employees in and out of the scheme, as would have been the case with a furlough agreement. So we need further guidance on this before agreement with employees can be reached, and hopefully this will be released in a timely fashion to enable you to have those discussions in advance of the 1st of November. What about the job retention bonus? So just finishing off with that, as we know, we did a webinar on this previously, but we've had a bit more guidance, as I said, come through from the Treasury. So the company will still be able to claim this £1,000 as a job retention bonus in addition to accessing this scheme. And that's on the basis that the employer will continue to qualify under the scheme. What are the qualifying conditions? Well, at the end of last week, we had that Treasury guidance. This has confirmed some of the terms that we believe would already be implemented. So it's available to be claimed for any employee who's been furloughed at any time. It remains the case that the employee cannot be placed under notice of redundancy prior to the 31st of January. And of course, they've got to remain employed up until that time. It's a flat rate of £1,000, no matter what employee it relates to. The bonus is paid to the company and it does not have to be passed on to the employee, unlike the furlough scheme and the job support scheme that we've just talked about. It differs from both in that respect. Remember, the employer must have paid a salary of at least £1,560 to the employee between the 6th of November and the 5th of February to be able to make that claim. They've confirmed that claims can be made between the 15th of February and up to the 31st of March. So it's quite a short window to make the claim. And again, we're looking for further guidance to come out with respect to how you make that claim. But as with all of this, they do sort of drip feed out the guidance, and we can do, if necessary, another webinar at that time to address that point. So that probably brings to an end everything that I wanted to say about the scheme. Has anybody got any questions?
No questions in the group chat yet. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute because we've got a fairly smaller group. Diane's just asking where the 77% figure has come from.
Just because, well, the government have set it. 33% of the hours have to be worked, which leaves 67%. And then you divide that 67% by 3 to get to split up the unworked time. And it's 22% that's payable then by the government. So in essence, the employer as a minimum has to pay 55%. The government pays 22, and then there's 22% that's not worked. That's really good for me because I'm not good at maths.
Okay. Oh yeah, she said thank you, so that's fine. Has anyone else got any other questions? Andrew, I think you've come off mute.
I have. I've eventually found the button after all these months. Sally, the dividends thing.
Yeah.
Directors, sort of Steve and I would pay ourselves. Most dividend is paid as dividend.
And a small PAYE. That's quite normal, isn't it, for a director? And what they're saying at the moment is that they would expect the large employers to not be making those distributions. So we're waiting for guidance on what the definition of a large employer is, and as such, therefore, what an SME is, to work out whether or not you'd be prohibited. I would suspect you'll probably be okay. But we need that guidance out just to clarify what the definitions will be, and then you can work out if you're a large employer, you shouldn't be making distributions, and if you're an SME that falls into a correct definition, you will still be able to make those distributions.
Change it as it is. I think there's changes coming to the budget anyway for things like that. So this might be almost a way of starting to fiddle with that dividend stroke
yes.
type. Yes.
All the benefits that you've had. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Sally.
No problem.
Okay. Anyone else want to come off mute to ask any questions? There is another one in the chat that I'll go through then if no one wants to come off mute. Okay.
I'll ask a question.
Oh, no, go on, Jenna. That's fine. You go. I can do the chat questions at the end.
Okay. If an employee changes their contract partway through the scheme, so say they went from full-time to part-time,
yeah,
I'm guessing the claim would be based on the hours of that particular period.
Yeah, well, they're saying that it's going to be based on what the hours are. If you think about how the pay and the hours were calculated under furlough, it was up to, if you remember, the 17th of March. It was a set date. And what they're saying is it will be based on the 23rd of September. But for me, Jenna, in that scenario, it would seem unjust that somebody would be receiving the grant based on their usual hours of work before they've entered into a flexible arrangement to reduce them to go part-time.
Okay, yeah.
So, although the snapshot would be the RTI information before the 23rd of September or up to that date, if during the scheme the employee makes, for example, a flexible working application to permanently change their hours, I can't see why the grant would be based on their previous full-time hours and not their part-time hours.
Yeah, okay, that's great, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. Simon, you're off mute, and Rob, you've put your hand up, and I noticed you came off mute as well. Do either of you two want to come in? Hi, Rob.
Yeah, hi. If an employee has already voluntarily signed an agreement to reduce their pay by 20% for a temporary period, so completely separate to the job retention scheme, would the employer be able to make this claim for the 20% under the job support scheme without an explicit agreement? So the employee's already signed a contractual variation to accept 20% less pay. So if the employer then says, okay, you only have to do 2 days a week, which would be the 40%, do you think we could make the 20% claim without a specific job support scheme agreement?
I mean, you've got to think about what the conditions are that they've laid down for the job support scheme agreement. So 1, it's got to be in writing. Well, you've got that in writing. 2, it's supposed to be a temporary change, and I presume that what you've entered into is a temporary agreement. Yeah,
to the end of Jan.
3, it's got to set out the hours that have got to be worked. 4, it's got to explain what happens in relation to the unworked hours. So the only thing that I can see is that you might not meet those conditions
the unworked
based
hours,
on Yeah, based on the current agreement that you've got. So you might just need to revise that with a further addendum that just clarifies those points.
I was afraid you might say that.
I'm sorry about that.
But thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Simon, I think you've gone back on mute, so I'm assuming yours was an accident. If not, come off mute. Okay, I'm going to go with
Come on, Simon, you know you want to.
I had one more question in the chat, though, if I could just read that out from Julie. I have a clause in the contract to use short-time working layoff. So is it acceptable to flip between the job support scheme and the provisions of the employment contract?
I mean, the fact that you've got, I think it's a bit like what I've just discussed with Rob. I think the fact that you've got the layoff and short-time working clause will be of benefit to you in making sure that you can say to the employees, well, we've got this contractual right to vary the hours anyway, which means that you're not in that position where some employers will be where they don't have those clauses and they're going to have to reach agreement. But I don't think that means you get out of doing a proper agreement to the employee that confirms what's going to happen in relation to this part of this of their employment and the scheme and how it's going to apply to them. So even though you've got that contractual right, you can refer to that in the agreement because you'll be invoking that to ensure that you're not in breach of contract. But I think you still need to set out the terms that will apply during that period to be compliant. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Cool. Okay. Has anyone else got any other questions then? Now is the time to ask. Well, we've got Sally and we've got a bit of time. Rob?
Any expectation of when we'll be getting the statutory detail?
Well, hopefully as soon as possible, because we're now on the 6th of October. And this is implement on the 1st of November. You guys are going to have to go away and go through those calculations that I've chatted through with you around what the additional cost to the company will be to implement the scheme. And so the sooner you know, the better. So I would hope that it would be coming out very shortly, and I hope they don't leave it towards the end of October, because then being able to arrange everything and get those agreements signed will be a bit of a nightmare. We haven't got any indication as to when it's going to be. All I can say is I hope it's as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sally. Final chance for any questions then.
I was just going to say, Sally, I'm sure I'm on MFG's mailing list anyway, but if not, can you just add us on there for the next, and just perhaps everybody on the group as well, just get an update from you when we
Yeah, as soon as we've got the guidance out, I'll speak to Olivia, and we'll either factor in straight away another webinar, and if we can't do it that way, then what I'll probably do is, for everybody that's been on the webinar, do a briefing note just updating you with, you know, what they've decided to do in the end and what the final position is. I mean, hopefully we can do it as another webinar, because these are really good, because you can all ask questions rather than just getting a piece of paper that says this is what the guidance says. But yeah, we'll do it either of those ways.
Thanks, Andrea. Another question, as it runs for 6 months, can we join at any point during the 6 months? Yes,
I think my understanding is you can join at any point, just like you can move employees in and out. I think you can join at any point and access the scheme. It doesn't have to be on the 1st of November.
Okay. Hopefully that answers your question, Diane. Well, I'm just going to give everybody, yeah, okay, cool. I'm just going to give everybody 30 seconds to have a quick think if you've got any more questions. And while you're thinking, I'm just going to reel off a couple of other HR-focused webinars that you might be interested in attending that are coming up. We've got a webinar with Sally again, twice in 1 week on Thursday, the 8th this week, which is specifically about home working. Sally's going to provide some advice and guidance for employers with anybody that's still got working at home. That's taking place between 12 and 1 p.m. and is of course completely free. We've then got a webinar on the 13th, which is the week after, with the NHS, which is about returning to the workplace. I know it seems a little bit confusing, but obviously we've got some employers that are dealing with people going back to the office and some employers that are still dealing with people at home. So that webinar focused on going back to the workplace is managing stress and rebuilding resilience of your staff. And the final one I wanted to let you know of is Thursday, the 22nd of October. We've got a webinar about how young people and businesses can benefit from the Kickstart scheme. So I know probably all of you as members will have seen the information about the Kickstart scheme that's currently out. We are a gateway provider and can help you with anything to do with that. So we thought we'd put on a little webinar just so you can see the benefits to you, the business, and to our young people if you're interested in supporting that scheme. That's on the 22nd of October. So you've had your 30 seconds to think of any more questions. Is there anything else from anyone else? Okay, I'm going to go with a no. Just lots of thank yous. So, okay, we'll wrap it up there then, guys. So a huge thank you, as always, to Sally.